Okay, good evening, everyone. We're ready to get started. Maseches Eruvin, Taf Gimel. Baruch Hashem, we started off. First thought wasn't so bad. We're actually going to continue right where we left off, which is the discussion in our Mishnah about whether or not we learn the shear of 20 amos from the Heichal. And that's going to be our jumping off point, where we start on the bottom of Daf Beis Mud Beis, about 6-7 lines from the bottom. And the Gemara says, El Me'ata, if in fact it's true that there are those who learn that 20 amos is learned from the Heichal, then lo tzihani le tzuras haPesach. How was the Heichal built? The gateway, the door, was built with a tzuras haPesach. And if that's true, the Heichal tzuras haPesach havyelo, then afilu hachi eser amos hu derebach. Why would, what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah taught us that if you have a tzuras haPesach, you flip right back. We're not that far. Our Mishnah said, v'im yeshlo tzuras haPesach, afal pishu rachav me'eser amos, ein tzarech l'mayit. But the Heichal had a tzuras haPesach. So if you're learning from the Heichal, then you shouldn't have a limitation in our Mishnah. That our Mishnah should say, according to the Tanakama, he says, Yamaid. Why does the Tanakama say Yamaid as a Heichal? That doesn't make any sense, because that's tzuras haPesach. So that's a contradiction for the Tanakama, which is what we have to try to understand. Allah matnan, if you hold that we learn from the Heichal, and the Heichal is a tzuras haPesach, then why then does our Mishnah say, Im yesh lo tzuras haPesach, afal pi sheracha me'eser amos eino tzarech l'mayit? So the Gemara here is trying to figure out all of these pieces. How does this work? The tzuras haPesach should allow for a wide extension beyond 10 amos. Says the Gemara, Midi hu taima elo leRav. All of this is only because of the Shita of Rav, who said that the Tanakama was learning from the Heichal. Hamasni le Rav Yehuda lechia bar Rav, kame de Rav. So Rav Yehuda was saying to Chia bar Rav in front of Rav, eino tzarech l'mayit. You don't have to reduce it. Amar le, and he argued and said, our Mishnah is the wrong language. You need to change the language of our Mishnah. Asniya tzarech l'mayit. It says you do need to, and the tzuras haPesach is in fact not a factor. We undo that part of our Mishnah. And according to Rav, the Mishnah that we have is not the script that he had. A very powerful idea that Rav was able to rewire this whole Mishnah to say, not like the way that we have it. But in fact, the tzuras haPesach does not help, and you have to be memayit if it's more than 10 amos. Elameata, still, if it's true that you hold of the opinion that that we learn the 20 amos from the Heichal, then lo tehani le amaltera. Now, in the Beis Hamikdash, the amaltera was a design that was above the doorways of, as we'll see soon, either only the ulam or possibly also the Heichal. So the ulam was a very, very large, that was the 40 amma door by 20 amos wide, huge. And at the top, we'll see what they were made out of, either wood or some decorative piece. But on the top of the doors, there were these large beams that were very visible. Fine. So in that case, we have to see exactly how this plays out. Let's see what the Gemara here says. If you hold that our Mishnah that we learned from the Heichal, then why didn't the amal teros help? Why didn't these blocks that were above the door help you? To ha-Heichal amal tera havyale. We know that the Heichal had these beams on top of it. Ve'afilu hachi esrim amma hu de gavoa. Even though there were beams, we still said 20 is the maximum. Ditznan, as the Mishnah writes, chamesh amal teros shel melas. There were 5 pieces of wood on top of the door, hayu al gabav, on top of the doorway. Zeh l'mala mizo, v'zo l'mala mizo, one stacked on top of the other. They were 5 logs tall on top of the door. So says the Gemara, well, that's not a good question. What are you concerned about? Dilma ki tanya hahida amal teros be'ulam tanya. Maybe the only place where these amal teros existed was only on the outer room, the ulam, but not on the Heichal. And therefore, if you're learning from the Heichal, you don't have to answer the question of the amal teros. Says the Gemara, that's not a good argument. That's ridiculous. No, because Dilma, it's very possible, tavnis Heichal ketavnis ulam. Maybe the amal teros, just like they were decorative pieces above the ulam, so too they were decorative pieces above the Heichal. And if it's true that there was these amal teros, these 5 boards that were on top of each of these doors of the ulam and of the Heichal, alama amar Rabbi Ilah amar Rab rechava daled afal pisha enu beria. This is one part of his sentence that's not relevant to our argument. I'll translate it loosely now. We'll get into it at a later point. That if there is a kored that's rechava daled, it's 4 tefach wide, afal pisha enu beria, but it's a rickety board, and then the next din is related to us. V'im yesh lo amal tera, afilu gvoa yoser me esrim ama, eino tzarech l'mayit. What do we see about the amal teros? If in fact there were amal teros above the doors of the Heichal, then 20 should not have been the maximum. because the amal turos were something that we're going to see soon in the language of the Gemara was for heker, that we could see it. We'll remember that there is a maximum height, and therefore we can learn that back to the world of Lavui. So that's what the Gemara is very bothered by here, is that if you're saying that we learn from the Heichal, and if the Heichal had amal turos, and if Rav says, and this was his line right here, what did Rav say? That if it's Yoser me Eser Mama, but with amal turos, then Eino Tzarech Lamayit. How do you understand our Mishnah? You can't then say that our Mishnah is talking about the Heichal as our source for 20 amos, because it shouldn't have said Eino Tzarech Lamayit, because it has amal turos. Says the Gemara, Amar of Yosef, you misunderstood something. The line that we just learned above, the one that says literally one line up, that line, he says, that's not Rav talking. That's Masni Sahi. That is a source in the Tanaim. Easy to mix up, because Rav was so early in the Amoraim that he bridged both worlds. Again, as mentioned, he was part of the Dor HaMa'avar, a small group of Amoraim that kind of straddled both worlds of Tanaim and Amoraim. So not crazy that they would mix up Rav with something in the Tanaim. Nevertheless, it's a source from the Tanaim. So the Gemara now wants to verify, well, who said, how do we know this? Man katanila, who's the one who knows this brisa? Amar Abaye, v'hachama berei de Rabba baravuach tanila, a reputable Amora, he was the one who was quoting from the times of the Tanaim. So says the Gemara, if that's true, that this comes from the Tanaim, that means that there's a brisa that says that with amal turos, eino tzarech lamayit. And if that's true, says the Gemara, v'tehavi amal tura masnisa v'tikshe l'Rav. Then how then could Rav ever say that the Tanakam of our Mishnah holds that the 20 is learned from the Heichal? The 20 amos can't be learned from the Heichal because the Heichal had amal turos and eino tzarech lamayit. So it's a catch-22. That doesn't work. So says the Gemara, Amar lach Rav, do you know what Rav would have told you under the circuit? He wasn't alive at this point. This conversation with Abaye was a 4th century Amora. Rav was the early 1st century. They lived about 150 years apart. Rav was not alive. So then you see the language of Amar lach. Amar lach Rav, what would Rav tell you? Dal ona mehacha. Please take me out of this conversation. You're talking about going head to head with two Mishnayos. Masnaisa milo kashana hadade. Obviously, there's a machlokes tanaim. You have our Mishnah, which seems to imply that even if we learn it from the Heichal, the maximum is 20 amos, and if it's more, then you might. And we have another shita seemingly in the Tanaim that says that even if it is above 20, we don't have to be mamait because of the amal turos. It must be that there's a machlokes tanaim. Me too. I also agree that there's a machlokes tanaim here. So stop hitting me over that. This isn't about me. There's 2 shitas in the Tanaim. I follow one of them. Leave me alone. I'm allowed to hold the way that I want if I have precedent within the Tanaim. Says the Gemara, no. We don't accept Rav's opinion. The Gemara argues as follows. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, below Rav, without Rav's assertion that we're talking about the Heichal, Masnaisa ahadade lo kasha. These 2 Mishnayos, these 2 sources in the Tanaim would never have argued with one another. Why not? Because L'Rabbanan, according to the Chachamim of the Mishnah, Koreh might a time amai. Why is it that a Korah works to allow for carrying in a mavui? Says the Gemara, Mishum Hekera. The reason why is because of Heker. Behai diktani yeser mi pischo shel heichal simna be'alma. We were just using the 20 amos as an approximation, but really the Iker is Heker. And that's why, and now just to paint a picture, yesterday we spoke about the definition of a Pesach. Do we say that the 20 amos of a mavui is learned from a Pesach from the realm of, as we saw in the Machlokes in the Mishnah, between the Tanna Kama and Rav Yehuda, between the Heichal and the Ulam, all defining what is a Pesach. Now Rav Nachman's introducing a whole new world, which is no, none of this is about a Pesach. This is about a Heker. We're afraid that people are going to forget that they're in Eruv land, and that if the mavui is down or if the mavui is too tall, then maybe they'll be carrying incorrectly. So the Chachamim put in rules, and they said you're only allowed to carry in this rabbinically restricted area, provided that there's a Korah that's within approximately 20 amos, provided that there's a Heker. And therefore, these Mishnayos are not contradictory. One is saying you have to be Mamait if the Heker is not there, and the other is saying you don't have to be Mamait if the Heker is there. So that's what Rav Nachman pushes back on Rav, and he says it's not about what you're saying. It's not about matching up to the Heichal. It's not about defining a Pesach. It's about defining what functions as a Heker. And says the Gemara, just about halfway down on Gimel and Aleph, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, okay, very good shita. You've introduced a new idea to us about Heker, that one is allowed to use a mavui, even if it's above 20 amos, provided that there's a Heker. But says the Gemara, that depends on whether or not you hold like Rabba. Panicha ilo svir le hadarabba. I'm okay with what you're saying, provided that you don't hold of the shita of Rabba. Ela isvir le hadarabba. But if you hold like Rabba, who says, we haven't learned what he says, here's what Rabba says. If you hold like Rabba, who says, the Amar Rabba, Ksiv, the pasuk says, "L'man yedu dorosechem ki basukoso shafti," so that for generations you shall know that you will therefore live in Sukkot, you live in a sukkah. Ad esrim ama yodea shadar b'sukkah. Up until 20 amos, a person knows that they're in a sukkah. L'malam esrim ama ein adam yodea mishum delo shalta be'ena. So here, what we see from Rabbah is a distinction, which is that 20 amos is a line in the sand where your eyes are no longer sholet. Your eyes don't go that high. It's 35 feet off the ground, 40 feet off the ground. It's pretty significant. So then here's what the Gemara is saying is a problem with Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak wants to say that this is all about heker. But Rabbah says that 20 amos is the maximum that your eyes will look. So if your heker is above 20 amos, then Rav Nachman only works if he rejects Rabbah. You can't say shlitas ha'einayim is at 20 amos and say heker above 20 amos works. That does not work. So that's the Gemara's question here, and we'll see it a little bit more articulate in a moment. Alma gabe sukkah nami behekera pligi. We see that based on Rabbah's comment that there's got to be this conversation by sukkah as well, whether or not the schach is above 20 amos, lo shalta be'ena. We don't look that high. So then just like by mav we have a machlokes, so too here, if lug betarte lamali. Why then do we have this machlokes? Why do we have a machlokes on both mavui and sukkah in regards to whether or not we say the 20 amos? Just tell me once what the shita is. Why does it have to be so different from? Why do we have to have the same machlokes in two cases? We have our Mishnah on Daf Beis, and then we see also by sukkah that's the machlokes that was the first Mishnah quoted as well in the Gemara. So our Mishnah against the first Mishnah in the Gemara says, I don't understand why we're having the same exact machlokes twice. Tanakam Rabbi Yehuda. Does heker work? Does heker not work? Why are we arguing about the same thing? And that's why he doesn't like the Gemara's answer about Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So says the Gemara, no, we're going to support Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's answer of heker because we needed both cases for machlokes. We need the machlokes tanaim that we have by Mavui Tanakam Rabbi Yehuda, and we need the same machlokes by Sukkah. Why? Tzricha. We need it whenever we see this. We always know what's coming. If not X, then Y. If not X, if not Y, then X. That's always going to be the formula for a tzricha. Though sometimes there are more layers because sometimes you're saying tzricha to 3 or 4 or 5 things. This is a more simple classical one. Tzricha. We need to have the machlokes in both cases. The iyashmin and gabe sukkah. If you want to say that the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda is by sukkah, the hakama Rabbi Yehuda came into the yeshiva avida shalta beina, because in a sukkah you sit down, you'll sit back, you'll lean, you'll look up, you'll look at the schach. What kind of schach did they use this year? You're going to look up, you're going to see it. It's going to be something that you look at because you're sitting down, no problem. Aval mavui, maybe I would have argued that if the machlokas was by sukkah, maybe by mavui del hiluch avid. What do you do in a mavui? You walk. When you walk, you look straight up at the sky. So says the Gemara, Ema moda luhula rabbanan. There maybe Rabbi Yehuda would agree and backtrack to the shita of the rabbanan that are more strict to say you should be mamayid. Why? Because when you're walking, nobody looks up in the sky when they're walking, not straight up in the sky, and therefore the Gemara says maybe we would confuse them. Therefore, we needed the machlokes by the case of mavui. Biyashmin and Baha, but if I only had the case of mavui, I might have argued that maybe only there are the rabbanon strict. Aval behach, maybe by sukkah ima modu le Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe the chachamim would have been lenient and followed the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda by sukkah tzricha. Therefore, we needed both cases. This basically supports the sheet of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. We weren't concerned about Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak because if he held of Rabbah, then his shita didn't make sense because heker is above 20 and Rabbah limits at 20. And the Gemara answers, we need this machlokes in both cases, and it supports the shita of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Let's get into a little bit of Beis HaMikdash construction. My amaltera, what are the details of this wood that was above the doorways of the ulam and the heichal? These 5, one on top of the other, these 5 pieces of wood. What is the deal with that? What were they? So Rav Chama berei de Rabba bar Avuha Omar Kine, Rashi, Dibur Hamaschil to the right, a couple of inches down. Dibur Hamaschil, where is it? Kine, that would make sense. Yes, Kine. Kigon Kine Ofos hayu bolten mitachas ha'ulam lemala mina Pesach. There were these decorations that were protruding out from these boards. They basically carved into the boards, and that's what was showing, this beautiful decor that was above the doors, very, very drawing on the attention. Back in the Gemara, that's Shita number 1. The Shita of, where are we? We are at the first of the longest lines of Kine. Kiyasa Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Amar, Amre b'ma'arava, they said in Eretz Yisrael, Piske de Arza. It's wood boards that are made out of cedar, a beautiful wood that just pops when you look at it. It stands out. Manda Amar Piske de Arza, the one who says, namely Rav Dimi, the one who says that what was actually above the doorways in the Heichal and the Ulam were just cedar wood, Kol Sheken Kine. All the more so, the decor that would stand out is that of the wood. That's of the birds and the chiseled out designs that would stand out even more. But the other way is not true. Manda Amar Kine, the one who says that what was above the Heichal doors and the Ulam doors was this decor of the carved out birds, Aval Piske de Arza, which is less dramatic, then I would say low, then it would not work. Umanda Amar Piske de Arza my taima. Why is it that Piske de Arza are attractive at all? It's just wood. Why are you? It's just wood. I understand the birds. It's unique, something standing out. Why are you saying that cedar wood is enough of a reason that people would look up? So says the Gemara, if you want to say Mishum de Nafish Mishche, because they're very long pieces of wood. Remember how big the doorway was, right? For the Ulam, the doorway was 20 amos wide. And this was a minimum of 20 amos of cedar wood. That's a big chunk of wood. And there were 5 of them. So it's pretty prominent. It's not like a couple of twigs on top of a tiny door. It was a massive piece of wood and 5 pieces of them. But says the Gemara, if that's true, that doesn't work because sometimes people have a lot of schach too. But we don't say that if it's above 20 amos because you have a lot of schach, therefore, we don't say that. So it can't be that the reason for the cedar, the reason why that worked for the Amal Teros is because it was lengthy. That doesn't work because schach is the same. Ella, it must be that the reason why Piske de Arza, why the wood worked, is Kavan de Kachashiv, because it was expensive and it was a major investment to get a beautiful cut of wood like this. Therefore, Islay Kala. It's like having something on your house that may or may not be so attractive, but because it's so expensive, everybody looks at it, right? It's like it's like an icon type of thing. You're just looking at it because it's a chashav bazach, but it's not necessarily in and of itself terribly attractive. So that's what's that? Limestone. You're the real estate agent that's starting to chime in on people's homes. This is all recorded, Gerald. I just want you to know that. So it's those kinds of things that when people spend, maybe, but that's what the cedar was doing. And that's what the Gemara concludes is because it was kachashivis like kala. People are going to talk about it. What happens if the board, the korah at the top, is partially within the 20 and partially above the 20? So let's say the board is a tefa, is an amma thick, and you have a half into the 20 and half out. So at 19.5 amos, the wood starts and it traverses the line of 20. How does that work? So says the Gemara, 4 lines into the widest lines, 2/3 of the way down, Daf Gimel, Amud Aleph, says the Gemara, Mixas Kor Besoch Esrem, Mixas Kor Lamalam Esrem. Part of the wood, part of the koreh has dipped into the 20 and part is above. Or equivalently, Mixas Chach Besoch Esrem, Mixas Chach Lamalam Esrem. Some of the Chach has dipped into the 20 and some of it is above. Amar Rabba, we'll see a big shift in ideas here. Amar Rabba, B'mavui Kasher Besukkah Pasol. In a mavui, if the koreh, it begins at 19.5 amos and then protrudes into the higher space above 20, that mavui is kasher. But by a sukkah, doesn't work. If the schach is thick enough that it traverses that 20 line, it's let's say a 5-inch thick piece of schach and it traverses that line, the halacha is that it's pasul. Asks the Gemara, my shna b'mavui de kasher. Why is it that by a mavui that we don't have a problem with it? And so the Gemara, Da'amre Kalosh, we could say that maybe it's a very thin piece of wood. It could just be that it's under the 20 line. Why do we have to say that it's so thick? The Gemara is going to give that answer momentarily. Patience. I know you've learned this 3 times already. The rest of us haven't. Sukkah nami lema kalosh, right? Sukkah, there too we could say maybe we should thin out the schach. Well, ikalashta habi lecham samuruba mitzilsa, a strong principle from the world of Sukkah land. No, if you're going to argue that we conceptually at least thinned out the wood by the mavui, maybe we did the same thing by the schach. And if you do that, then the schach is going to be so thin that it has more holes than it has schach. It's more sunlight than shade, and that's not kosher. Hachanami, ikalashta havi korah hanitelas baruch. And if you thin out, and you go back, it's just going back and forth. But also, if you thin out the korah, then maybe it's something that would be nital baruch. It would blow away. Alal korachach, it must be something else. No, it's nasa kishipudin. It must be that it's like made out of metal. Says the Gemara, hachanami kalashtale. Sorry, skip the line there. Kishipudin shel matechetz. It's made out of metal. Hachanami al korchach nase still some rubim mechamsa. You're making up these concepts. You're saying you're going to thin the wood over there by the mavui. I could do the same thing by the schach. You're making this conception. No, it's conception like the korah by the mavui is made out of metal. Well, then it's also true by the sukkah. So again, I still don't understand. Why would Rabbi say that by a mavui, this case where the beam is half in and half out of the 20 mark, of the 20 amma mark, why is it that he says it's still going to be kosher by a mavui? Amar Rava mi pruzke. Rava says, sukkah de liyachid hu lo midkar. A sukkah, which is where even only one person is going to sit there. That happens all the time. So lo midkar, he's not going to notice what's going on up there. But mavui de l'rabim michdere ahadade. But when you're in public, so people are going to say like, oh, look, the Korah, it's interesting. It's right above the 20 mark and right below the 20 mark. People are going to talk about it. There's a lot of us in the room. We're going to see what's happening. So that's why the Gemara says, answer number one, that the reason why we make this distinction of why a mavui is kosher and a sukkah is not is because by a mavui, there's a lot of people there. They're going to talk to each other. By a sukkah, you could even be alone there. And therefore, Rabbah says that by a mavui, Rabbi says that when the Korah starts at 19.5 amos and traverses into the 20 land, he says it's still kosher, but not by a sukkah. Next answer of Ravina, which is what Michael was just saying, Amar, sukkah del raisa achmiru barabanan. The rabbis who said, they're very clear. They recognize that a sukkah is a din del raisa, so therefore, the rabbanan were machmer, that you're not allowed to have your schach begin at 19.5 amos and go up into the 20 amos. So you're not allowed to do that. But mavui de rabbanan, lo achmiru be rabbanan. So that's seemingly very clear. A good question, a couple of answers. But the Gemara doesn't like this because there was a whole nother approach to this Gemara. And it totally reverses psychology, as we will soon see. What did we just say? We said, well, one person sitting in the sukkah, so maybe he won't see the top. But anyone who walks around in a mavui, there's other people around that are going to remind each other. So just hold that in mind as we learn this next piece of Gemara. Rav Adabar Masna Masni La Shmaisa de Rabba Ipcha. He taught the whole statement of Rabba the exact opposite. We had initially said by Rabba that if the Korah starts at 19.5 amos and traverses to, let's say, 20.5, that the mavui is kosher and the sukkah is not. What does it say here? Amar Rabba, the exact opposite. The exact opposite. The mavui pasal, the sukkah kshera. So it says the Gemara, Maishna sukkah de kshera. Why here, according to this version of Rabba, why then would you say that the sukkah is kosher and the mavui is not? The Amrina, because we could have argued that conceptually the schach was kalish, that it was a thinner schach. It says the Gemara, "B'mavui nami lema kalush." I could have also argued that the beam in the mavui was also thinner. Like, why would you only say that by sukkah? Says the Gemara, well, if you said that over there, if you said by mavui kalashta, then havalei korah hani telas baruach. If you would have said that we could have conceptually look at the korah and the mavui as thinner, then it could have blown away. Says the Gemara, hachanami kalashta havilei chamsam ruba mitzilsa. If you would have said that by the korah, then I would have argued that by the schach. If you made it thinner, that it wouldn't be kosher schach because now there's more sunlight available than shade. Ella al korchach, it must be nase silsa meruba mechamsa. It must be that we automatically treat it as though it's more shade than sunlight. Says the Gemara, you can't do that. Hachanami, if you're going to do that, al korchach nase kishipod shel mateches. Then I would say the same thing by the korah. It says if it's made out of metal. So again, all of these back and forths about whether or not we are allowed to conceive of the korah as thinner don't work, because I could have argued that by the korah and I could argue that by sukkah. Whatever answer you're going to give for one, I can give for the other. So that's why the Gemara doesn't accept this, and therefore we fall back to the answer we just saw a few lines ago. Amarava mi pruskia, sukkah de yachid hi. So totally the opposite. A sukkah where even only one person might sit, what's going to happen? Rami anafshei midkar. He's going to recognize in a sukkah. We just said 10 lines ago, you're not. So this is one of those times when we have to, where the chachamim, we're trying to get into the cup. How does a yid function when they're sitting in a sukkah? If you're one person sitting in a sukkah, are you more likely to look at the schach or not? Version number one of Rabbah is that you are not likely to. Version number two, Rami anafshei midkar, you're much more likely to remember it. And then as well, mavui de l'rabim, he samche ahadade v'lo midkare. And here he talks about this group psychology. We're all walking together. Well, if he's not noticing there's a problem with the mavui, then neither am I. Right? We do that all the time. That was that woman who was killed many years ago. She was stabbed many times in public, and nobody called the police because everybody thought somebody else called the police. Kide amre inshi. That's what the Gemara says right here. Kidera de beishutfe. If you have a pot that's a common pot, everybody usually uses it to make noodles. So everybody comes home, they're waiting for dinner to be made. Lo chamima v'lo karira. It's not hot. Nobody cooked it. Nobody put it on the fire. Nobody touched it because everybody thought everybody else was going to do it. So this is Rabbah's version number two, which is that when you are in public, we assume that someone else is going to find the problem and you're not going to look up, and therefore by a mavui it's going to be problematic. Ashein kain by sukkah. Ravina Amar, he gives another answer. Again, all of this is just these two It's Rabba, but reversed. And Ravina Amar Sukkah Daraisa L'Bay Chizuk. This is also interesting, right? Well, Michael, what you had said a couple of moments ago is that when something is Daraisa, we're more Machmir. So he says the opposite here. This says Ravina Amar Sukkah Daraisa L'Bay Chizuk. You don't need Chizuk by din Daraisa. Everybody knows it's Daraisa. Mavu Darabanan by Chizuk, but because by a rabbinic injunction, we are concerned that people might get lenient. Therefore, by Chizuk, we do need to make sure that we're more strict there. My Have'ala, how do we paskin? Answers the Gemara, Machlokas. Rabba bar Rav Ula Amar Zev Pasal. One says that in both cases they're pasal, both by the Mavui and by the Sukkah, where it's 19.5 to 20.5, where the piece of wood or the schach traverses the 20 line. So that's one shita of Rabba that he is the Machmir. Rava Amar Zev Kasher, and Rava says that both of them are kasher, and that seemingly is how we paskin. Let's turn to the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis. We're going to learn until about 3-4 lines from the bottom of the page. I had made some numerous gentle references to this when we were learning the Mishnah about the fact that 20 is the volume inside. If you had a 20 amma block and you stood it inside and built on top of it, that's how we measure. It's not like at 20. It's above 20. That's when we start saying Mamayit. So that's what the Gemara here is saying on the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis, to not make the mistake. Sometimes in another frame, we have this concept in Gemara of ad ve'ad bichlal or ad ve'lo ad bichlal. Until you're 20 years old. Does that mean 19 and 364 days? How do we look at the number? So here we're saying that the 20th amma is a part of the count. If we put in a 20 amma, then that would be the halal. So that's what the Gemara says on the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Halal sukkah tanan, halal mavui tanan. In both cases, when we talk about sukkah and 20 amos, and when we talk about a mavui and 20 amos, it's 20 amos, and then the korah will be there. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava, Tanya de Misayeh alach. There's a brisa to support this idea. Mavui shu gavoa, the brisa writes, a mavui shu gavoa me'esher mama, yoser mi pischo shel heichal. Look at the language, greater than the opening of the heichal, which was at its minimum. There was a vacuum of 20 amos, yemait. Only then do you have to be mamayit. Says the Gemara, v'heichal gufo chalalo esrim. That we know that the heichal itself, this is the inner door, the door into the kodesh. That door was exactly a cavity of 20 amos. Hold on 1 second, Rav Papa. You thought to bring a brisa, doesn't work. Ketzad hu oseh. We don't yet know the context, but let's see. Maniach kore misfas esrim ulemata. The ketzad hu oseh is, how do you put up the kore? At what height does it go? So this source this is quoted as a source in the Tanaim, and it seems to say that you put it misvas esrim ulemata, which is exactly the opposite of the halal idea that there's 20 and then the beam. So the recommendation here, argues Rav Ashi to Rav Papa, what? Misvas, from the lip. Yeah, maniach korah misvas esrim ulemata, from the 20th, and then you put the korah inwards of the 20. So that's just clearly not what we're talking about. We're allowed to have still higher than that. Ema ulamala, answers the Gemara, no, it shouldn't have said ulamata, it should have said ulamala. Says the Gemara, that's not a very good answer. Beha lamata ktani. We all know what it says. You can't just change the word because it's more convenient. So then you have to give a real answer. Says the Gemara, no, it's to teach us another din. Hakamash malan de lamata kilamala. That the lower level of a wall is similar kilamala. Malamala chalala esrim. Just like when we talk about what's the highest that a mavui can be, is 20 amos, and that's a halal. That's when there's a cavity of 20. Aflamata, the smallest type of mavui, has to be 10 tvachim off the ground. Halala asara. There too, it cannot be below the line of 10 tvachim off the ground, which is about 40 inches. And also, frankly, the minimum of a halachic wall for mechitzas and some other things that come up in other areas of halacha. So that's what the Gemara is saying, though. The language here that was used, ulamata, was not to teach that you actually put the koreh into the space of 20, into the halal. That's not true. But rather to teach you a side din. That just like by the 20, we are referencing 20 and then koreh, so too by the minimum, because that's the maximum of a mavui, so too by the minimum, by 10 tvachim off the ground. It's 10, but making sure that there is a space of a full 10 underneath, and then the mavui, then the koreh would show up there. Amar Abayi Mishmei de Rav Nachman, the 2 dots, about 8 lines down on Gimel Amud Beis. Abayi says it says in the name of Rav Nachman, Amas Sukkah ve'amas Mavui ve'ama bas Chamisha. Big discussion. And the more archaeology that we find out about Yerushalayim, the more we would be able to clarify these Gemaras. How many, kaviyachal, we would say how many inches are in a foot, how many tfachim are in an amma? So that's a big discussion. So the Gemara says here that there are some times that we have it that it's 5 tfachim to an amma, and sometimes it's 6. So let's see where we apply each of these cases. So Abaye says in the name of Rav Nachman that when we're talking about the amas sukkah, about the measurements of a sukkah, and the amas mavui, those measurements, that's be'ama bas chamisha, the more lenient. So let's say, for example, just for argument's sake, I'm not paskening here, that a tefach is 4 inches. So then an amma is either 20 inches or 24 inches. So it makes a big difference over the scheme of things. And also, when we say that something is only mutter at a certain height, then it depends how many amos you have. If you're measuring an amos, you need to know what the units of measure are. Do we measure in centimeters? We have to figure out how many centimeters are in a foot, how many inches are in a foot, how many feet are in a yard. We need these answers. So the Gemara says in the name of Rav Nachman, Abaye speaking, that when it comes to sukkah and mavui, we consider the amma there to be bas chamisha, it's 5 tvachim. Amas kilayim, when it comes to kilayim, there our measurement is different. The amma bas shisha, that's a larger amma, which has 6 tvachim in it. So it's 24 inches. So it's 20 versus 24. Amas mavui be'ama bas chamisha l'may hilchasa. We already said mavui was going to be 5. It's the smaller shear. To what does this apply in regards to a mavui? Where within mavui do we use this idea of 5 tfachim to the amma? Answers the Gemara, legovho, for the height, ula pirtzas mavui, and for a pirtza, right to left. We said that if it's 10 amos or more, that's problematic. How do we measure that? We measure with a smaller unit of measure, which is a chumrah. Because let's say that, just do the math. If you have 10 amos and you go by every amma is 24 inches, it's 240 inches of a hole versus 200 inches of a hole. So the more machmir one is the smaller number because there are fewer tfachim to go around. So that's what the Gemara is saying here, that we have a chumrah by mavui. Says the Gemara, we have a chumrah by mavui. Hold on one second. If you have the depth of a mavui, the meshech is the depth. All we've spoken about is the height of the wall and the right left of the wall. We didn't talk about how deep a mavui has to go to make it 3-dimensional. So there the Gemara says it has to be arba amos. But if you say that it's the smaller amma, so then you have a kula, and that's not how you've been treating this case until now. Everything's been a chumrah. So says the Gemara, a couple of answers. Keman de amar ba'arba tfachim. No, I disagree with that shita entirely. I would say that the depth of a mavui has to only be 4 tfachim. Ibay Seiman, some say no. When Rav Nachman was of the opinion that by a mavui we use the amma to be 5 tfachim per amma, that's for most things, but not for everything. Ibay Seiman ba'arba amos, but rova amos kamar. We were only talking about most things, but taka, when it comes to the depth of it, we do use the larger measure of 6 amos. What about Amma Sukkah halfway down on Gimel Amud Beis? What about Amma Sukkah be'Amma Bas Chamisha? We said that when we're measuring for a Sukkah, we said there also we use the units of 5 Tfachim per Amma. L'may hilchasa. Which aspects of the halachos of Sukkah is that true? So it says the Gemara, number 1, L'govha, in regards to measuring 20 amos. And number 2 is U'ladofen akuma. We'll get to this in much detail in Maseches Sukkah. But dofen akuma is basically as follows. Let's say that you have a house where your wall goes up to the roof and the roof overhangs a little bit, and then you have your schach. So that wall where it turns and it's a little bit of an overhang, how large does that have to be in order to passel your sukkah? So it has to be dalet amos. If it's more than dalet amos, then that wall is no longer a wall. But if it's less than dalet amos, so you have a wall that goes up and then it curves, if that space on the top is less than dalet amos, the schach, you can't sit under that part, but the schach is still kosher, that still counts as a wall. And it's referred to in halach as a dofen akuma. So the space up top, that's what we're measuring as bas chamisha, as 5 tvachim to the amma. Asks the Gemara, v'a'ika meshech sukkah be'arba amos l'kula. Careful, we don't want to be too mekel. What about the depth of a sukkah that's also 4 amos? The Tanya, Rabbi Omer Ani. Rabbi says, this is a very common refrain from Rabbi where he says Omer Ani, I say. He says, kol sukkah she'ein ba dalet amos al dalet amos psula. So how does that work out? You're going to be mekel and you're going to say that we only use 5 amos for the depth of a sukkah? That doesn't work because all the other aspects of the 5 tvachim to an amma was a chumrah. And here the 5 tvachim to an amma would be a kula. Says the Gemara, we don't paskin like Rabbi. We paskin kirabbanan. What do the Rabbanan hold? The Amre, afilu ena machzekes ala rosha v'ruba v'shalchano. The minimum amount of a sukkah is not dalet al dalet amos, like Rabbi said. We don't even entertain the shaila of how many tfachim are in an amma. We don't paskin like Rabbi, we paskin like the Rabbanan, that the minimum size of a sukkah is Rosh of Aruba v'Shulchana, which plays out to be 7 tfachim by 7 tfachim, a very, very small measure. Or you could say really the Olam Rabbi. We do hold like Rabbi that the minimum area footprint of a sukkah is 4 amos by 4 amos, and just like we answered before, V'rov amos kamer. It's just in general it's normally 5, but in this case it would actually be 6 tfachim per amma, and that would solve that problem. Last mini sugya for the night, all connected still. Amas kilayim bas be'ama bas shisha. When we are talking about the isser of kilayim, of planting 2 different growth types together that are not allowed to be grown together, so there we use the larger shear of shisha tfachim la'ama of 6. As the Gemara Lamai Hilchasa, what does this refer to? What aspects of kilayim do we apply the shisha tfachim? So it's 2 areas that we're probably somewhat unfamiliar with, unless we've learned the halachos of kilayim carefully. Says the Gemara, one is the karachas hakerem u'lemachol hakerem. A karachas hakerem, as the Gemara will say, is a bald patch in the middle of your field, and the machol hakerem is the outskirts of your field that are up against the fence. Says the Gemara as follows. What are these cases? Ditznan, karachas hakerem, when we're talking about a bald patch in the middle of the field, at what point are you allowed to plant again in the center of that bald patch? Beis Shammai omrim, only when that gaping hole is esrim be'arba amos, when it's 24 amos. Beis Hillel omrim sheishes amos, it has to be only 16, a more lenient shita. This is where the Gemara says that we define the number of tfachim per amma to be 6. And as well by machol, last of the short lines, machol hakerem, first of the longer lines, Beis Shammai omrim sheishes amos, Beis Hillel omrim shtenis amos. This is a machlokas there, whether or not the machol hakerem, the distance from the fence until the beginning of the growth of the crops. So there, that's a machlokas, whether it's 16 amos or 12 amos. That too is measured with 6 amos per tefach. Good. So that's where they apply this in that world of kilei hakerem in regards to the bald patch in the middle. How large does it have to be to allow planting again in that space? And also up against the fences where the crops grow as well. How large of a space do we need to allow for planting? And just for our own background knowledge, Eizohi karachas hakerem, what is this bald patch in the field? Kerem shecharav emsi'iso, where the middle of the field got destroyed. Im ein sham sheishes amos lo yavi zera l'sham. If there are not yet 16 amos in that circle, an area 16 in diameter, then you're not allowed to plant anything else there. Hayu sham sheishes rei. If there was 16 amma, then no sein lo kidei avodaso, then you're allowed to. The zoreas hamoser, you can even plant more. What did we say the case of machol hakerem was? Veizehu machol hakerem, bein kerem legader, between the vine and the actual fence. Here is also where we measure with shisha tfachim le'ama. Im ein sham shtemes re'ama, if there are not 12 amos from the gate until the grapevine, lo yavi zera l'sham, you're not allowed to plant anything new. It might be kilayim. And hayu sham shtemes re'ama, had in fact there been 12 from the gather to the kerem, from the fence until the grapevine, then no sein lo kedei avodaso, you keep 4. The phrase of kedei avodaso is in order to do your work. It's a reference to saving 4 amos for them to walk and to bring their tools. So there we would say no sein lo kedei avodaso, leave 4 amos away from the fence, and then vizoreas hashar, and then you'd be allowed to plant. And all of this is just a brief discussion, and obviously all connected to sukkah Sukkah and Mavui, because we're trying to figure out how many amos are there how many tfachim are there in an amma? Is it 5 or is it 6? By Mavui and Sukkah, we had basically said 5 with the exceptions of the depth of them, which might be 6 according to Rabbi. We'll stop here. Mr. Hashem will pick up tomorrow night. Is today Wednesday? Today is Wednesday. So tomorrow night is daf and a half. Getting to some pictures already, as you can see on daf Hey Amid Aleph. And Mr. Hashem will pick up tomorrow night at 8:40. Have a beautiful night.